Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Sunoikisis's Digital Classics Summer Term 2021. Today is our 12th session, and I'm very happy that today we have Samuel Huskey with us from the University of Oklahoma, the director of the Digital Latin Library. So Sam today will present the Digital Latin Library that, of course, was mentioned many times in our program, because this is a wonderful project, very helpful for us. And as usual, you have the class outline. In GitHub, I have to say that today the class outline is very rich of information because you have a complete description of this session, which will be about the two main components of the Digital Latin Library, the catalog and the library of digital Latin text. And then you have readings, many readings, also different resources concerning the Digital Latin Library, but not only, in general, our work for digital classics, and then also an exercise that maybe we will be able to comment briefly at the end of the session. Today, we have also with us in the panel Paolo Monella from the University of Roma and Francesco Mambrini from the University of Milan. So they join us today for the discussion about this topic. But now, so Sam, thank you very much for accepting the invitation, for being with us today. You were with us also last week for a discussion about the Cited Loci project with Matteo Romanello, but today is your turn, so we know more about the Digital Latin Library, which was also briefly presented 2 years ago when Katie Felkner showed her work on Servius as part of the Digital Latin Library project. But today we have Sam, so Sam, thank you. Welcome to Sunoikisis. And okay, so now you can start.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me make sure that you're seeing the slides properly.
Okay, yes, we can see your slides. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, it works.
All right, good. Let me then move over here. Okay, so thank you so much, Monica, for inviting me to present here. I've enjoyed participating in the previous sessions. It's been really educational for me. Today, as you said, I'm talking about the Digital Latin Library project. And before I begin, I wanted to mention the funding and support that the Digital Latin Library has received over the years, particularly from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, with generous support through 3 grants, and the University of Oklahoma, my home institution, has been the host of the project. The Society for Classical Studies and the Medieval Academy of America and the Renaissance Society of America have all been very supportive in terms of publicizing the project and helping to get organized. I also wanted to mention a few friends, partners, and collaborators who have been part of the project from the very beginning. My 2 co-PIs on the grants, Chris Weaver and June Abbas from the University of Oklahoma, and then you'll probably recognize the names Hugh Kalis and Tom Elliott, who are part of so many digital humanities projects, and then Jeff Witt, Cynthia Damon, Robert Castor, and as you mentioned, Katie Felkner. There are many more people to thank, of course, but I wanted to make sure to highlight the contributions of these people before I launch into talking about the DLL in general. Okay, so the Digital Latin Library is actually 2 projects, and they are the Digital Latin Library Catalog and the Library of Digital Latin Texts. I will deal with each of these 2 in the different halves of this presentation. So let me begin by talking about the DLL catalog. It was originally conceived as a linked open data resource for finding and using Latin texts. And there's the URL if you want to go there. You can browse the catalog or read about it. There's a lot of information in the FAQ also. But what I'd like to do is give you an overview of what the DLL catalog was originally intended to be and what it has become. So the original goal for the project was stated in one of our original grant proposals, which was that the DLL aims to provide a single point of access to all Latin texts and resources and a place for reading and working with them. That's a pretty ambitious goal. And the way we planned to pursue that goal was through linked open data. That was the watchword or the watch phrase for this entire project. Since you've already talked a little bit in previous sessions about linked open data, I probably don't need to go into it too much, but I thought I would do a little bit of an overview just in case. And may I ask, Monica, if you're still seeing the slides as expected?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
Everything
great.
works.
Thank you. Okay. Well, linked open data can be a very complex subject, and the definitions aren't particularly helpful when you look at the standard resources online. For example, at Wikipedia, you find that linked data is structured data which is interlinked with other data, so it becomes more useful through semantic queries. And linked open data is just data that is linked and openly available. But this might leave some people wondering and kind of looking like this poor little dog here and asking the question, what? What do you mean by all of that? And if we look further into what linked open data is, we can see Tim Berners-Lee's basic concepts. They're helpful, but they're still kind of difficult for people who are coming to it for the first time. Use uniform resource identifiers as names for things. Okay, so we have to understand what URIs are. Use HTTP URIs so that people can look up those names. And that just means that they're on the internet and available through the web. When someone looks up a URI, provide useful information using the standards like RDF and Sparkle, and I'm going to talk a bit about those later on. And finally, include links to other URIs so that users can discover more things. Okay, that's kind of helpful, but you still might be feeling a little in the dark about what linked open data really is about. So let's do a deeper dive into the subject. And I put a link to the linked open data cloud in the resources for this session. It's kind of an overwhelming image to look at, but I really encourage you to go to that URL if you haven't already and play around with it, because it's an interactive image. When you highlight the different nodes, you'll see all of the connections to other nodes, and it really does bring to clarity what the idea behind linked open data really is. It's to link all of these resources in an open way. The major participants of linked open data, or at least as represented in this linked open data cloud, are libraries, as you can imagine, life sciences organizations, users of GIS and other geographical databases, government entities, linguistics, people who work on linguistics, different projects there, and social media and networking has a robust presence also, as you might imagine. But one of the things that doesn't have a really big footprint in the linked open data cloud is the humanities, particularly in classical languages. We have a lot of really great resources, but we're still in the early days, really, of finding a lot of participation among projects in a linked open data kind of method. So the original idea for the Digital Latin Library catalog was to be a linked Latin library. And I'm going to show you a few of the drawings that we did early on, many, many years ago, to give you an idea of what those early concepts were and what we were thinking. And I'll ask your indulgence. Feel free to laugh at the following drawings because I'm by no means a graphic designer. So here we go. The original idea was this linked Latin library represented by this swirling vortex here is a central location for being able to find and use texts and other resources that are available elsewhere online. It would have a interface that would allow queries of this vortex, and other projects would contribute their own linked open data resources, and that way they would all be discoverable. And these lightning bolts represent APIs and other services to resources in various other projects. The architecture that we decided on was to have a server with a website that published its own data in a linked open data format. And it would be published in what's known as a triple store that consists of data in the resource description framework, RDF. These are triples. They're known as triples because they're simple statements of subject, predicate, and object using metadata to identify what everything is. In that kind of a setting, you can do some pretty robust queries, and it's possible to link out to other projects that have their own linked open data resources published in a similar manner. The idea would be to have a Solr search engine. Solr is just a NoSQL kind of indexing service that can make available a lot of information very rapidly. It's especially good with text-based searches. And to facilitate searching, we'd have a Sparkle endpoint, Sparkle just being a recursive acronym, Sparkle Protocol and RDF Query Language. This was a pretty simple concept, but the problem, the real weakness in this is this part. It relies on other projects to make their own data available in a linked open data way. This is not to say it is in any way a shortcoming of other projects, but it really does emphasize the community aspect of working with linked open data. I'd like to speak briefly about some of the challenges that were brought to the surface when we were initially trying to build out the linked Latin library. Linked open data, as I mentioned, requires buy-in from the community. And by that, I mean, people have to recognize that this is something worth spending their time, resources, and funding on. And those are very serious considerations, especially if you have your own objectives for your projects. Linked open data is open and accessible, but producing it takes money, time, and expertise. And that expertise is not to be taken lightly because the learning curve for implementation is pretty steep. That's not to say that people haven't done it. There are some linked open data projects in classics, and this is a sampling. I want to emphasize that because I'm sure that I have not made a comprehensive list here, and I apologize if I've left any major players out. But I highlight the first three because of the wonderful work that's been done with the Open Greek and Latin project and Perseus and the Perseus catalog. I want to highlight the Perseus catalog because it's been so helpful to us in developing the Digital Latin Library catalog. In particular, Alison Bebu has been a real great collaborator, very generous with her time. And of course, you've already heard about Snapdragon and Pelagios, Recogito, Pleiades, the Classical Works Knowledge Base, and the Digital Library of Late Antique Latin Texts. As I said, there are many more projects that have some aspect of a linked open data feature to them, but there are also many other non-linked open data projects like the PHI Latin Texts, the Latin Library, Obra Latina, and Brepolis Library of Latin Texts, which is also behind a paywall. As I said, this is not a shortcoming, and I'm not meaning to put any blame or anything on the maintainers of these projects. They have their own objectives, and they do things, the things that they have set out to do very well. It would be fantastic if we could reach a point where everyone was publishing at least a subset of information in a linked open data format, so there could be greater interconnectivity among the different projects. That's why I have put up an image of some silos here and down in Texas. They're great at containing the things that they do contain, but it would be wonderful if there were more links out and sharing of resources. So we decided on some more modest goals for the DLL catalog. Rather than being the single point of access that we thought of back in 2012, we've decided to create authority records for authors and editors of Latin texts, create work authorities for Latin texts, catalog all editions of Latin texts, which, okay, that's not such a modest goal, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, and to publish linked open data in as much as we can, and to build applications to facilitate the publication of linked open data by other projects. That's part of our mission to build community in terms of the linked open data aspect. The reason why we focused on authority records is that, as you've seen in previous discussions of named entity recognition and the citation problem with cited loci, authors and works are known by many different names, titles, and other identifiers. And citation of authors and works varies across publications and platforms. The need for disambiguation is great. So, for example, there are many works known as Carmina. If you're not citing the author along with the title, that could be any number of things. It could be Catullus, it could be Horace, it could be anything. So we wanted to create URIs that would designate unambiguously the different works and the different authors of those works. Let me give you an example with Ovid. Ovid has many, many human-readable labels. We know him as Publius Ovidius Naso, but we also know him by many other forms of his name in different languages, in different forms. And I highlighted the U in the second entry here because many years ago, if you went to the L'Année Philologique database and you searched for Ovid, you wouldn't find him unless you thought, okay, let's change that V to a U, and all of a sudden you had records about Ovid. They've, of course, changed that, and it's a much more robust search engine now, but it is the case that orthography even can lead to some confusion. And then there are also the various identifiers by which he is known. We have Library of Congress numbers. We have ISNI numbers. We even have 2 different identifiers in the canonical text services system. The PHI number for Ovid is PHI 0959, but there's also a lesser known STOA number for Ovid. So it's important to provide a central location where queries of any of these things can connect you up to information about the person we know as Ovid. The status of our authority records so far is that we have 3,229 authority records for authors and editors. It's important for me to mention that we also include editors because they're an important reference point also when you're searching for editions. You might want a particular edition, or you might want to know which works certain editors are associated with. And we also have 5,261 work authorities so far. We have author pages like this one. This is actually a conglomeration of calls to different parts of the database. It's bringing in connections to Ovid's works and their work authorities, also some biographical information that can be downloaded in a JSON LD format. And if you scroll further down, you'll begin to see records for individual items associated with Ovid. But the actual authority record that lies behind that is a much more extensive collection of information about Ovid, the various forms of his name, biographical information, geographical connections, and various URIs and URNs by which he is known. The challenges that we encounter with authority records is that right now, the majority of records are from the classical era, and that's mostly because it's a closed canon, so it's easy to have a beginning and an end point. With medieval and Neo-Latin authors, the sources are much more diffuse and open-ended, so it's an ongoing process to track down the various names of authors and editors associated with those works. And of course, gathering, cleaning, and processing the data is an arduous process that we are trying to make easier through automated scripts. As for individual items in the catalog, we've got close to 2,500 items in the catalog now, including references to the PHI texts, Biblioteca Italiana's Latin text, the Perseus Digital Library, the Digital Library of Late Antique Latin Texts, and over 500 Teubner volumes from HathiTrust. There are many other works, of course, that we need to catalog, and that brings up the challenges that we have for dealing with the item records. We can accumulate data rapidly through web scraping. You can go out to a site and pull down all of the data related to works on a particular resource. And that is a pretty easy and quick process. But cleaning, reconciling, and preparing that data for the catalog can proceed at a glacial pace because it involves a lot of human editing and cross-checking and making sure that everything is correct before it can be published. Another challenge is staying up to date because, of course, some resources continue to publish information, and it's important to be able to go back and crawl sites and come up with the new additions. There's also the problem of how to manage certain PDF collections of works. So I can go to HathiTrust, for example, and pull down many different records of PDF copies of things with the title Opera. That doesn't tell me what the works are that are inside of that volume. And usually there's no record of those entries. So it takes a lot of manual scrolling through PDFs and trying to find the actual content. This is where there might be opportunity for collaboration, maybe with Cited Loki or Snapdragon or other projects that are dealing with named entity recognition, for example. I'm eager to see if there are ways to speed up that kind of work. As for publishing linked open data, we do have the records that are currently available published online in the catalog and on GitHub as JSON LD. That looks like this. If you've done the assignment, you've worked on one of these records. It might not look exactly the same as what I'm showing you on the screen, but we selected JSON LD or JavaScript object notation in a linked data format because it's a very easy format to serialize. It's pretty human readable, and there are existing tools that make it easy to work with it. You may have noticed in the JSON LD playground that you can do a visualization of that data. And this can help to understand what you can do with it. The idea here is that eventually, when we build that triple store with a endpoint for searching, if a person comes to the catalog with any of these identifiers, any one of them will lead to links to the author records, the work records, any item records, and any additional resources out on the web that might be related to that particular author. That means that there are many, many points of discovery and many ways of making connections within the data. The challenges for dealing with linked open data are that we want to make this more accessible and usable, and that's going to require some extra work in developing the search capacity, making an ontology to make links more discoverable, and things like that. It's also difficult to keep pace with developments in technology and methods, particularly if you are, as the DLL is now, a team of one, at least until we are successful in applying for some more funding. And then, of course, there's funding for data entry. There is so much data to be entered, and we need to be able to train people to do that very important but meticulous and tedious work. Then there is the task of persuading other organizations to adopt those practices so that we can begin to establish those connections. That's why we're trying to facilitate wider participation in LOD by creating applications that make it easy for people to do that. They can take existing data and turn it into linked open data pretty quickly. Just to close up this first part of my presentation, I wanted to talk about the ongoing projects of the Digital Latin Library catalog. As I mentioned before, I'm working on an ontology for the DLL that will make it possible to use what are known as reasoners to go through the data that we have to make connections that might not be readily recognizable to human beings. It will also help in facilitating robust searching once all of that is available. We need to add to our list of site crawlers and scrapers and work on better synchronization with other projects. Automate the processing of data, particularly PDF data, as I mentioned, and add manuscript collections to the catalog. I think this is actually going to be a reasonably easy thing to do, mostly because many manuscript collections are already using TEI XML to catalog their manuscripts. And we also want to continue working on establishing partnerships with other producers and consumers of linked data. Okay, now I'm going to move into the second part of the presentation, the Library of Digital Latin Texts, which is a platform for publishing new born digital critical editions. And it's available there at ldlt.digitallatin.org for you to see if you wish, with plenty of information about the project and links to the pilot edition or the test edition that we did of Calpurnia Siculus. As I mentioned at the outset of this presentation, the affiliated organizations are the Society for Classical Studies, the Medieval Academy of America, and the Renaissance Society of America. They have been instrumental in developing the policies and procedures for the LDLT, and that's been very important in terms of establishing the whole possibility of publishing digital editions in this format. At the beginning of this project, we had certain goals. One of them was to create a data model for critical editions of Latin texts. Without a data model, we would just have random projects rather than a uniform way of looking at critical editions and turning them into a corpus. We wanted to develop applications for working with the LDLT data, mostly because most human beings don't want to look at XML, for example. They'd prefer to work with a nice readable layout or interface. We needed to develop policies and procedures for operations and publication of editions, and we needed to publish editions. So that leads me to ask, what is an LDLT edition? And I'll just mention a few things about, or a few characteristics about what LDLT editions are. An LDLT edition is a critical edition of a Latin text or text. That's the first thing. It's very important to note that our goal here is to publish the same kind of product that you're familiar with from looking at an Oxford Classical Text or a Teubner volume, a Boudet, any of those other, familiar critical editions. We're doing the same thing. It's a critical edition. It's also peer-reviewed scholarship. That is also important, since peer review is a gold standard for publishing scholarship. Scholars need to have that assurance that their work is peer-reviewed so that everyone knows it has met a certain standard. It's also a publication, and that's important to emphasize because an LDLT edition is absolutely something that you could put on a CV and count towards your creative activity as a scholar. It is textual data encoded in XML according to specific guidelines. That's important because we're using an open standard. We have published guidelines for how to encode different types of information, and the specific guidelines ensure that everything is in a uniform format rather than having unique idiosyncratic projects just existing under one umbrella. Editions are published in version-controlled repositories with auxiliary materials. This is something that is, I think, an advantage over the traditional format of publishing critical editions. We publish in a version-controlled, distributed version control repository so that the data is available at all times for people to see for verification purposes, but also to be able to reuse that information. It also gives editors the opportunity to publish, along with their editions, images, collation tables, notes, correspondence, all of the things that go into making an edition, but that most people are never allowed to see, mostly because it's impossible to get to that material unless you visit an archive or ask the editor for a copy of something. They're also available for use under an open license, and the editors retain the rights to their work, though they agree that the edition is published through one of the learned societies associated with the project. It's important also to talk about what an LDLT edition is not. It's not a custom designed interface that highlights the unique characteristics of a specific text. Our argument is that we're responsible for publishing the data related to a critical edition. It's important that people can take that data and make those interfaces that highlight specific aspects of a text, that they can develop tools for using it if they want to, but our editions are not those things. Those are things that we consider scholarship that can be go forward using our data as a source. An LDLT edition is not a web page, although we do make the editions available in an HTML format for ease of use and reference. It's not a codex, though you can take a PDF of the data and make a print-on-demand edition if you wish. And it's also not available only to paying customers. That is, our editions are not behind a paywall, and they don't require you to pay to use them in any way. So moving further into these editions, we have to talk about a critical notion, and that is that all critical editions as they are currently are actually databases. Those of you who have seen me talk about this before are familiar with this slide. This is the result of an exercise that we did where we looked at a standard critical edition and identified all of the different kinds of information that are encoded on the printed page. And I say that they're encoded because these editions are actually visually encoded databases. Whenever you look at the text of a critical edition, the different typographical conventions and layouts are saying things to you. They're encoded in a way that your eyes can understand them. So let's look at some visual encoding. You can see that italic text and bold type, spaced text, small capitals, underdots, diacritical marks, various kinds of abbreviations, superscript and subscript in some instances, specialized punctuation marks or punctuation marks used in a special way are part of the visual encoding, and also sigla, the single letters that we use to refer to manuscripts or families of manuscripts. All of those are visual types of encoding. When we talk about digital Latin, we're really talking about Latin text in a form that both humans and machines can use, preferably in a way that leverages the unique capabilities of both. That is, humans are very good at reading and interpreting information and adding meaning to it. Machines are really great at calculating, counting, sorting, doing all of those routine tasks in a very rapid way. So it would be great to have editions that allow us to do both of those types of activities. Let's look a little bit more closely at this idea of text as data. I've highlighted here a portion of a critical editions apparatus. And if we look at the types of data that are highlighted there, you see that there's a location, and that's the line number within the main text. There's an implicit lemma. So in most critical apparatuses, you don't have the lemma from the text that the variant is referring to. You have to make that, that connection yourself. There's a variant reading that is set in italic type. There are witnesses indicated by single letters in both Greek and Latin type. The Greek type in this instance refers to manuscripts. The Latin type refers to the editio princeps. We talk about sources in our data model to differentiate them from witnesses. Sources are more along the lines of, as you see here on the screen, references to modern scholars who have either had editions published in the past or who have commented on them or written articles or something like that that's germane to the text. In this instance, there are no sources available for this particular entry, and there aren't any annotations either. And by that, I mean editorial annotations such as this one up here where it says corrected by the first hand, or other kinds of editorial annotations that elaborate on some aspect of the entry. If we have our text as a data kind of object, or if we think of our text as data, we can actually turn it into tabular data like this. And I think Katie Faulkner spoke about this in her presentation a couple of years ago, translating apparatus criticus data into tabular format so that it can then be iterated over and processed by a script using, say, Python or some other application to facilitate the encoding of the Latin edition, of the critical edition. You can use this kind of tabular data and a pure text file of the text to create the XML encoding. Of course, it can also be done manually. It's just that this type of manual encoding can be quite tedious, and my concern there is that tedium leads to distraction, and the last thing we want to do is introduce new errors into a critical edition. So we look for ways to automate it as much as we can. But in the LDLT edition, what we're doing is we're encoding explicitly the line number and the line. The apparatus is encoded directly into the text rather than being at the bottom of a page ready to be ignored. The lemma is here for people to see that this is the word that is being referred to. The reading tag gives us the variant reading with witnesses, and all of these pound symbols indicate that there is more information about these witnesses further up in the text or in the edition. And then we close up the apparatus and we begin resume the actual text, and that continues on throughout the edition. Encoding the information in situ like this means that it's always there and it's explicit rather than relying on human readers to make the connections, often with nothing to alert them to the fact that there's information available to them. As I mentioned, one of our goals for this part of the project was developing a data model. And we've done that. It's available on GitHub. The HTML version is also there for you to peruse. It's quite extensive and probably somewhat intimidating to go through and look at every single thing, but we felt that it was necessary to give plenty of examples and to cover all of the different aspects of all of the different types of information that you might find in a critical edition. And it's, of course, not a data model that sprang fully formed out of our own heads. Using the best practices of linked open data and various other digital humanities methods, We built this data model on an existing model, and that is the Text Encoding Initiatives model for encoding texts in XML. We also incorporated elements from Epidoc, which is a customization of TEI that deals with texts that are inscribed on stone or on other materials. This is because many of those markings and types of writing that you'll find are similar to the things that you'll find in a manuscript. And for that reason, we also borrow some from papyri.info, which is another TEI-based project. An LDLT TEI edition has its own ways of doing things, but they all conform to the greater standard of the TEI. And you'll see here that there are structural elements to a digital edition here. There are also the elements of the apparatus. There are, again, a structural element with a line number. There's even a way to link in a commentary so that editors can make a more extensive textual commentary without cluttering up the apparatus criticus. And as I said, most people don't want to read raw XML, and who could blame them? For that reason, we wanted to make some tools available for working with this data. One of those tools is the reading room. This is Hugh Kalis's creation. The idea here is that the apparatus criticus is indicated with these dialogue bubbles. And in this screenshot, someone has highlighted or clicked on this particular bubble, and we find that the word it refers to is highlighted in yellow, and it brings up the variant reading and the witnesses. If you then click on that variant reading in this interactive viewer, the variant reading is shifted into the text itself so that you can evaluate it in situ. You can evaluate it in place and get a sense of why the editor may have decided to use quamwis instead. You can see here, in case you didn't catch that the word changes as you click on it. There are other features. If a text has been tagged with orthographical variants, morphological variants, and other kinds of variants, you can turn those on or off to filter out elements from the apparatus criticus. And if you scroll down to the bottom of any of the individual items in the text, you'll see a more traditional apparatus criticus in case that's what you want to work with. This is also able to work with the Alpheos reading tools so that you can have parsers and dictionary lookups if you wish. So it's a very dynamic reading room. We also developed some experimental data visualizations. This is where my colleague Chris Weaver from the School of Computer Science at OU comes in. He has a software suite known as Improvise, and it's all about looking for novel ways of visualizing data. I emphasize that these are experimental data visualizations because it may be that no one actually wants to use them. We were concerned to show people what is possible, what you could do with data if it's encoded in a way that is machine readable. Here's an example. There's a storyline visualization. What we have here is the text as printed in the edition, and each one of these lines represents one of the witnesses, and you go lemma by lemma, and you find that there are different degrees of participation by different witnesses. They come together, they diverge, they sometimes cross over. All of this is to show the story of how all of those variants might have been sifted through to eventually create a critical edition. It's a way of tracking what the editor has done in an edition. Another one is this pixel-based visualization. This has a text viewer up top with highlights of any variant readings that there might be, or any entries in the apparatus criticus. And as you scroll through the reading text, this scrolls horizontally so that you can see things coming into focus in this middle column. You can see them broken out by lines, how many different variants there might be, by page, by witness. The colors indicate the degree of variance using something called Levenstein edit distance to show how far apart a variant reading might be from the lemma that an editor included in a text. Again, this might not be something that anyone ever wants to use, but it shows how powerful encoded data can be, at least over the traditional view that you have in a printed edition. Though that view is powerful in and of itself, as you might expect for something that has been developed over hundreds of years. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that we've also developed a traditional way of viewing these XML texts. Hugh Kalis and I worked on a routine or a pipeline to take the XML, turn it into LaTeX, which is a typesetting language, and then into a PDF format that does a pretty good job of reproducing what you might find in a traditional critical edition. This is something that you could take and print on demand as you need to. The challenges in this area include the technical barriers. They're significant. Not everyone wants to learn XML. Not everyone wants to learn how to do all of the other things that I've mentioned here. And that's okay. Our goal is to facilitate participation by editors, whatever their level of technical ability might be. We're working on routines that will, in fact, Katie Felkner presented one, that will allow an editor to hand off to us text files and spreadsheet files to a certain standard that we can then turn into XML fully encoded, where then we can work with the editor to make adjustments for things that couldn't be handled by our algorithms. And as I said, this goes hand in hand with the technical barriers, the reluctance and resistance of many people to dive in and do a digital edition. Because often people think, of course, that a digital edition means they have to come up with not only an encoded text, but an interface and all of the other things that you have to do to publish something online. So we're working on lowering that resistance by showing people that it really is possible to do the work of philology and publish it in this format without having to do a lot of the technical work. There's a lack of consensus about digital editions, what they are. What is a digital edition and what ought it to be? A criticism leveled against what we've been doing is that we're trying too hard to reproduce a print-bound format instead of looking at native digital formats. And that's certainly a valid criticism. Our point, though, however, has been that the traditional way of doing things and visualizing them is very powerful and has a lot of lessons for us. And we've wanted to take advantage of those lessons, implement them in a digital format, and then let other people take that data and run with it to make new tools, new ways of looking at the information. There's also a lot of uncertainty about the evaluation of digital scholarship. It is at times difficult to persuade one's peers that a digital project ought to count the same as a book or an article or any of the traditional formats. So we've been working on ways of helping people to make the case that their work counts just as much as traditional kinds of scholarship. One of the ways we've done that is by developing a publication pipeline and being very explicit about it. There's a pre-proposal query process where a person writes to one of the affiliated organizations and asks, is there already an edition of this text in the pipeline? If not, then there's a proposal stage. The proposal has very specific contents that have to be included that demonstrate the reason why this edition should be pursued and how it will be pursued. Then there's the development process, where an editor might work on their own or with me to do the actual encoding of the text. There's a peer review stage, which is managed by the learned societies associated with this project. And finally, there's publication in a version-controlled repository with the DOI and something we're calling the traveling imprimatur, which is really a tag that can be verified against an independent service to say that this text that you're using is in fact the published version of the edition published by the Digital Latin Library. And then it's added to the LDLT site for people to use if they want to view it in a simple HTML style reader. A certain number of intrepid souls have already undergone this process, and we have a number of projects that are already in the queue. Some of them are very near to completion, others are just starting out, but I'm excited about all of them, and they represent everything from classical to medieval to Neo-Latin studies. And I'm very excited about this because it looks like eventually, as more people become accustomed to this and see the kinds of things that can be done, we might get even more projects underway. Also in development, we continue to work on applications to facilitate and or automate the encoding of critical editions. We are working on some suggestions for guidelines for evaluating digital scholarship that individuals can take back to their own institutions and say, this is what I'd like my project to be seen as accomplishing. And workflows for sharing our data with other projects like Open Greek and Latin, Dickinson Classical Commentaries, Pelagios, Pleiades, other projects. These are all part of the larger project that I mentioned earlier in connection with the DLL catalog. Finally, before I close, I wanted to make sure that everyone knew about the education aspect of the Digital Latin Library. Since, at least in North America, textual criticism is not frequently taught, not commonly taught, we thought that it was important to provide some tutorials, some videos that featured acknowledged authorities in the field talking about their craft. All of these videos are available on our website or on our YouTube channel free of charge. And I hope that people will go and make use of them because it's some really great content. And I was really pleased that we're able to get so many wonderful people to come to Oklahoma and undergo filming these lectures. It was an all-day and very elaborate affair, but I think they turned out very well, and I'm eager to see them used more often in classes or by individuals. So that is most of what I wanted to say. I want to thank you again for inviting me to participate in this session. I hope it's been interesting, and I encourage you to go to digitallatin.org though I'll note that I'm currently in the process of migrating all of our sites to a new version of our content management system. So you'll be seeing some changes in the coming months. You can follow us at Digital Latin on Twitter. And if you have questions that you want to discuss, or if you want to pursue any kind of work in collaboration with the DLL, I'm happy to converse with you over email. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And yeah, there we go.
Okay, so Sam, thank you very much for this very informative, clear session. I'm sure there will be many questions because you mentioned many complex things, but I think in a very clear manner, especially for our audience, where we have, well, not only experts, scholars, but also students with different backgrounds, both in classics and in computer science. But I think that really it was great. And I also have to mention that Paolo Monella has been twittering during this session. So with the hashtag SunoikisisDC, you can follow also this session. And in any case, the slides are also in Gita. But I think that now we can open the discussion. We are perfectly on time. We have 30 minutes for our discussion. So please, we can start with the questions. And I think that just one thing, so you mentioned many things, I love this. So the mantra today is facilitate participation, which is, of course, a big challenge, but our main goal today for philology in general, for digital classics, and things are happening, as we could see today. So please, questions. We have people on YouTube.
Okay.
Yeah, so we have, I know that there is a slight delay on YouTube, so maybe people, anyway, you can, you know that in the audience, you can write your question in the chat in YouTube. We can read your question and answer to your questions. But I think that we have a first question from Paolo, probably. Yes, Paolo, please.
Hi, Paolo.
Hi, I have more questions than what I'm asking right now, but just to start off, this one is one I hadn't thought before. I very much like the idea that you are publishing by materials, so raw collections, the preparing materials for an edition. And that's something that's dear to my heart because I have seen that there is some resistance in the field of textual philology to expose the dirty content of your desk, of your work desk. Right. I very much agree in terms of Popperian falsification, and I'd like to know if you encountered any resistance to that idea to show, you know, that by material.
I haven't encountered any resistance so far because it is entirely voluntary. It's up to the editor to decide what materials, if any, are published alongside the edition. But I do encourage it because, as you said, it's part of the process. It's one of the things that I think makes it more. I don't really want to use the word scientific, but you know what I mean. It's by exposing the materials used to make a critical edition, you allow readers of the edition to hold the editor accountable for decisions and examine the raw materials themselves to see if maybe they would have made other decisions. It has to do with the whole idea of reproducibility, I think. So.
May I quickly reply?
Yeah.
Sam, you are very diplomatic, much more than I am. I would definitely use the word scientific. And when I was a traditional classicist, I confess, which I shouldn't do in a YouTube recorded thing, that sometimes I had this feeling that you can cover up, especially when you're doing literary criticism, so basically interpreting passages, you can cover up some faults in your documentation if you use rhetoric well. Mm-hmm. So if a scientist, a chemist, wouldn't expose their data and would cover everything up in good rhetoric and writing up the article, they wouldn't be considered scientific. I always tried to, and that's a cover up, so I try to be intellectually honest, but we run a risk to not be entirely intellectually honest when you do literary criticism. And textual criticism is different, but then again, not everything goes into the apparatus. There is a selection,
Right.
and not everyone in the readers is fully aware of this. That the large majority of readings don't go there.
Yeah.
So,
and this is why, pardon me, we declined to introduce into that online reading tool a box where you could say, show me only variants from this manuscript, because we didn't want to create the perception that by doing that, you would somehow reconstruct that witness. Because in pretty much every critical edition, it won't be the case that every variant from every manuscript will be recorded. So it's important to leave that for people who want to take the deeper dive into the ancillary materials. So if you do a transcription, a full transcription of a witness, sure, make that available to people if they want to use that. But the critical edition gives you the benefit of what an editor has learned and thought about in compiling the text. So, yeah.
Yes, I think this is very important. This is something that we have been learning in the last years. So this is also the reason why we don't have a definition of a digital edition. What is a digital edition? This is an open question. We can't answer now, and definitely in the future we won't be able to answer that, because we have to experiment. We have to work with dirty data also. This is what we have to do. This is difficult. We don't want to do that as a humanist, as philologists. We always have this problem. But this is something that we have been learning, and also the fact that the printed edition is one of the outputs of this work. And you mentioned that also in the digital Latin library, so there is the possibility to export the work in the printed format, which is a specific technology, I think. So the technology of the printed critical edition is a wonderful technology. The risk is to replicate that technology with the machine, which is, I think, very dangerous. We shouldn't do that. I think it's a different thing. It's a different output, and but still we want that. And so, yes. So this is really an aspect, and I think that this is also important, considering that we're talking here about the digital Latin library. So a library, the first generations, and we have to use the plural, I think, of digital libraries in general, were meant to produce at least a machine-readable version of classical text, and then the catalog. Mm-hmm. We know for other projects that back in the 70s, in the 60s of last century, we had these projects. So the first goal was that. Now, of course, we can add this other goal to produce different versions of the same text, so adding the critical part. But still, this requires a lot of work, of course. And yeah. So, but other questions, please. Francesco, yes, of course.
I would have a question. If there are no students or younger participants who would like to ask a question, they of course should go first. But if not, I mean, my question would be, I mean, how to bridge the two parts of the of the presentation, so to speak. I mean, so the very, very direct question would be, do you have a plan to publish your editions as linked open data, or a roadmap to do something like that?
Yes. One of the ways we want to make use of the Digital Latin Library catalog is, pardon me, by using the authority records, the URIs that we've developed, incorporating them into the editions when we need to point to authors, or if we want to make sure, of course, that any editions referred to in an LDLT edition are in the catalog, and make those openly available as people make use of our own editions. there are many possible points of contact between the two halves of the project. I have a really absurd diagram that I could show you, but I'm too embarrassed about my graphic design skills. But yeah, one of the ambitions is eventually to make it a more make a better bridge between the two halves of the project, make it more obvious how they relate to each other. Does that answer at all?
Yes. No, so if I just can make a comment, a follow-up
Sure.
comment, because by the way, I loved your diagram, the one with the spiraling at the center, and that also goes to my follow-up comment that I would really encourage you to keep up with this ambitious plan. Also, because I think that what you are doing will get you exactly there, and I mean it even from experience, because I too work for a project that use linked open data in Latin, and though we work, and we also have, I mean, probably not me, but our principal investigator had a very, very ambitious program just to link everything that uses a Latin word to that word with this specific URI. And so this also entails that we want to go into dig deeper into those editions to just look for those occurrences of words, and that is a very ambitious program, because this gets you into a modeling series of modeling problems that are also quite challenging.
Yeah, just imagine what you could do when all of those links are established, right?
Indeed. And by the way, if anybody in the audience is interested, this project is called Lila. We also have a triple store, which by now you all know what it is. And I can pass the link in the.
Francesco, I'm so sorry that I didn't put that in my presentation. Of course, Lila is very important. I've been so impressed with the work that you all are doing. It's, you know, you have linked right in the name of your project, and it's just a fantastic work, and you've got a good team of people going, and I think that there are some really good opportunities for us to stay in touch and try to collect.
Definitely. And I was also coming exactly to this, that we are in the process of modeling some of this corpus information. I mean, we look at it from the linguistic angles. So from us, we mostly think of everything as a linguistic corpus of texts and editions. But also, I mean, we're not blind to the fact that these are critical. Most of these corpora are based with the collection of critical editions, and the critical part must be there. It's an information that probably will not put there, but the great thing about linked open data is that everybody works on his own angle, and then all these different perspectives on the same objects go together. And but we are definitely looking to the digital Latin library to provide all those informations that you showed in the first.
Great. Yeah, let's chat offline sometime.
Indeed.
About all of that.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you. Also, because, I mean, if you said that one of the challenges is the fact that not many projects use linked open data, so that there is always this challenge in linking. We are, and we want to. I mean, we want to be extremely serious on the fact that we want to be there even when the funding is over and everything. So the sustainability is a thing. It's a very important thing for us. So it's I think it's really important that if we share this perspective, really, yes, we
absolutely. And it's also I've seen it as kind of a personal mission to develop some workflows for creating linked open data, so that people who are interested in doing it don't have to learn all of the individual technologies to make it happen. I think that's one of the keys to getting more participation and getting more projects linked up. So yeah, that's developed into kind of a side hobby of mine, writing those kinds of applications.
Thank you.
Yes, no, thank you for this last point, because this is fundamental. So again, facilitate participation. This is another aspect. So connecting linguistics, corpus linguistics, philology, digital philology. This is where we are. Of course, there is a huge amount of work because, and the other thing is that we still miss data. This is the reason why there is a lot of work to do, because our dream is to connect, for example, a resource like Linked Latin with every possible variant in our manuscripts of Latin text, but then sometimes we still miss data. So machine readable data for inflected forms for lemma. Of course, now we have a lot of data for linguistic annotations, but still there are other things that are missing. Another thing you mentioned, for example, titles used in traditional editions like opera. I know that for Fragmenta, of course, those let's say labels, they are the results of traditional philology. They are very important, but we know that they hide a language. I know that for Fragmenta, in our sources, we have the preservation of titles of fragmentary works, and we want to preserve them. Now we can do that, but of course, and I'm doing that for a project, but this is a huge amount of work to identify the language, to annotate the language, to lemmatize it, etc. But anyway, we have this, this plan. But a comment also in the
Hi, Cecilia.
chat. Okay, Cecilia Criado.
I think it got split into two comments.
Yes, sorry. There is first this. Okay, the count. Okay, yeah. This is the first comment.
Are editors expected to redo collation? Oh, right. No, there's no need to redo collation of manuscripts by any means. You can base your work on the pre-existing standard editions. You can, it really, that's the kind of thing that you would include in a proposal to the SCS or the MAA or RSA. You'd say, this is the method and approach that I intend to take with my critical edition. That's where the peer review process would come in, with, asking questions about what that would look like. Are there other approaches that you might take? What are the existing resources that you might be able to use? My own view is that we should make every effort to take advantage of existing work, so that there isn't replication of effort. In fact, there are some who argue that we shouldn't be doing brand new critical editions, but rather making collations of existing apparatus criticus. But I don't know about going to that extreme. But yeah, Cecilia, if you're interested in pursuing an LDLT edition or something of that sort, certainly send me a message and consider making a query of one of the learned organizations associated with the project. Does that answer your question, Cecilia? I'm sorry, I may have rambled there.
Well, I may add one thing. So this question, of course, is fundamental, but this is a question that we had also before for printed editions. And I think this is important because sometimes I see this very rigid definition of digital critical editions. A digital critical edition has to be an edition where you collect every possible witness. But wait a minute, there are many printed critical editions that are not really based on a complete collation of the existing manuscripts. We have to say that because sometimes it's really impossible because, and probably because there is a lack of experience in traditional philology. And this is where we have to say, okay, the goal of my project is, okay, to produce really a new complete critical edition where I want to produce a new reconstruct the text. So I decided to really analyze every possible witness of the source. And then I produce my critical apparatus. But there are many printed traditional critical editions where editors use the work done by other previous editors. We have to say that. I know that by experience also. So now sometimes in a digital world, I see these extreme request, okay, this is not a critical edition because you didn't check all the manuscripts. So, well, that depends on the goal of the project. And this is also one of the reasons why we have probably very few digital critical editions, also because today the focus is on, for example, transcribing an entire manuscript, which is something that we didn't before, and definitely this requires time. So this question, I think, is very, very important to I don't know, to discuss the meaning of a digital critical edition, not forgetting also the past, I think. Yeah, please, Sam.
No, I was just going to agree with you on that I can certainly imagine someone, for example, taking a TEI XML text from Open Greek and Latin and using that as a base for a critical edition that is based on a review of existing critical editions, and maybe someone knows of a new source that needs to be examined in the light of everything, or as Richard Tarrant did with later manuscripts of the Metamorphoses versus OCT, just maybe there's a brand new approach that doesn't require someone to go do all of the work of collating every single witness, because there are actually very good collations already. So yeah, I think leveraging the existing scholarship is a perfectly acceptable way to move forward, and I think it's probably the one of the clearer paths to getting new editions out. So.
Yes, absolutely, and this is something that we have been experimenting with. So using OCR outputs of printed critical editions and expanding them, adding more critical elements, which is something completely new. This is something that we can't have in a printed environment unless we produce a new edition based on a previous critical edition. But this is something we have been experimenting with, and this is interesting because, of course, here we see that textuality is in some way broken. We have a new concept of textuality, and we can add other critical aspects. For example, the project Linked Latin, and by the way, I added in the chat also the links, and also Francesco kindly sent me the link for the Sparkle page of the project. And again, so when we annotate Latin and we lemmatize each inflected form, this is a critical activity. Maybe this is not philology as we mean it in the last in the last 2 centuries, but again, so this is another new aspect of doing, I think, producing critical editions. I'm opening really a gigantic debate, because we could discuss for hours about that, but these are really interesting examples. Well, now, please, Sam.
I think it's great that you're opening up that subject, because it is such a vast subject, and there are a lot of camps that have developed about what a digital edition is. But I think there are real opportunities for us to have both and instead of either or with a lot of these projects, especially if we have a lot of sharing. If someone takes, for example, an edition that we publish and uses it to do further research or make an interface or a visualization tool or something else, I think that's a great example of the potential of reuse and the strengths of taking different approaches in this area. So I think there's another question. I'm having trouble reading it. Okay.
Yes, Anise Ferreira, our friend from Araraquara. Okay.
Okay. I definitely think acquiring the data for the catalog is is not a very difficult part of the equation, but certainly processing it and cleaning it and linking it up and reconciling all of the records, that can be a very painstaking and tedious project. And there's only, there's quite a lot you can do with automation, with harnessing the power of computers to sift through information, but there's also that human expertise that can't be distilled into an algorithm that I think is very important to emphasize. It's often where the bottleneck occurs because we don't want to just put dirty data out there. But I think it's actually one of the opportunities that we have for highlighting to some of our colleagues who aren't fully aware of what digital scholarship is, highlighting where the human part comes in and where the expertise is really located. Is it a content area expertise? Is it technical expertise? Or is it some combination of those two things that creates something new? Does that make sense? Or am I speaking gibberish?
No, I don't think so. And the catalog, whenever we have philology, we have the catalog, which is another critical activity, is a selection. So yeah, okay, Anisa, she says yes, true, yes, okay, she agrees on that. Yes, the catalog is the other super interesting thing, where we miss data also. Well, for Latin, maybe less, because we already have authority lists in Latin, thanks to philology. But again, we miss data because, again, we have these labels, in different modern languages, but also in Latin. But then if we want really to connect a catalog to every form of those names for authors and titles of works, or at least descriptions of works, because mentioning the catalog again open another big scenario, because we don't have fixed titles in ancient works, and this is super fascinating. And then this is where we have been experimenting, for example, with name entity recognition to identify those expressions in our text, and the way those expressions have been annotated in printed editions, and especially in indices of authors in critical editions. So again, this is another critical activity. This is pure philology, and today producing these catalogs for the Digital Latin Library, the Perseus catalog, is philological activity, like in the past, mentioning just the Alexandrian library, when the first librarians were philologists, first of all. Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, we still have 3 minutes for, yes, unfortunately. So the discussion is extremely interesting. But anyway, so if there are other questions, I'm looking at the outline. Anyway, again, for our audience, you have the slides are already, there is a link to the slides in our page in GitHub, the complete description, the session outline. There are different readings and also blog posts from the Digital Latin Library website, various papers, that they are accessible, of course, different resources, and then also links to different standards, including, of course, the Link and Ancient World Data, Text Encoding Initiative, and other also vocabularies and softwares, and also the exercise, so with a complete description of the exercise where you can create an authority record in JSON LD. So for Ovidius.
Of course, I didn't mean to imply that we're all sitting around here writing JSON LD manually. That's something that machines do, but I think writing at least one record definitely gives people a sense of what's involved. So good experience, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Paolo, yes, please. You have, yeah.
quick question. I've read the name of Cynthia Demon among future editors. I'm very happy that this wall we've been discussing on other occasions between traditional philologists and digital philologists is being torn down. The quick question is the following. What's the feedback that you have from people from traditional philology in terms of user friendliness? So we want to now get into the huge issue of, well, how digital should a philologist be to do digital philology? What's the feedback that you have? Is it still too hard for them?
Well, it varies. Cynthia has been very fun to work with because she actually put it to us as a challenge. She said, I'm not going to type a single angle bracket. And yet she has been adjusting her way of working to a more digital mindset. So that's been very important. And she's illustrated very well what happens when you shift from just writing your apparatus out in a word processor to thinking in terms of discrete bits of information that are part of that communication. And that has been really eye-opening. And she's actually used that as a teaching tool for her seminar. So that's been really great.
I love the answer because I think that, I mean, I have been in cases in which people do type the angle brackets, but basically they think in a codex approach. So they put everything in a note field, and that's not digital. But
Right.
the other approach that you're talking about is really what we need to communicate with the broad audience. So good news from to you.
Yeah. It was great that she said that, and it challenged us to find ways of making it easier to think digitally without typing angle brackets. So.
Okay, excellent. Another example of facilitating participation, which is our mantra for today, definitely. Okay, so now, unfortunately, our time is over, so we have to close the session. But Sam, thank you very much. This session was great, very, very clear, I'm sure, for our audience. And again, you have everything online, so I hope we will be able to have Sam soon in the future for other sessions, but our discussions are very active, and you can follow these discussions on Twitter also for future developments. But now, so next week we will have another session, and we will have a session about the German project EAQUA, okay, which is a set of different tools for text reuse detection and for other text mining activities. And then we will still have for this program from this semester 2 final sessions, but about Egyptology. So we go beyond classics, beyond Greek and Latin, and so we will have 2 sessions for Egyptology. Okay, but for today, thank you again to Sam, Paolo, and Francesco for joining us, and also thanks a lot to the audience. We have a crowd today. And okay, so see you next week. And again, good night, good afternoon, good morning to our extended audience in the world.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ciao. Bye. Bye.